we're forced to really dig into what matters and how to find that joy. And the high side of it is then when we do, the joy is unconditional.
I'd like to welcome to the Journeying Soul, Kimberly Warner. Thanks for being on the show, Kim. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on was because so many people live with chronic illness.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a bit of I'm a person who has a chronic illness. You're a person who has a chronic illness. And it is a bit of a club in a way where there are people who have it or have a loved one who has something like that, and they know certain things. And
Yeah.
then the people who haven't had any of that life experience are living kind of very different lives, it seems to me. But for you, what I like too is that you're taking what you've seemed to do is have taken a lot of the experience and taken the gift part of it to let it change your life, to change your work. And from it, you started Unfixed Media. And so my first question in the let us begin realm is, what does it mean to be unfixed?
Yes. Well, this word has been with me, I think, since 2019, which is around the time at that point I was 5 years into living with a neurological disorder called debarquement syndrome, and which is essentially, just so that people that are listening can have an understanding, it's a classically a vestibular disorder, though there's nothing wrong with the vestibular nerve. It's not in the ear, it's in the brain. And it produces this perception of constant motion. So the motion for some is bobbing, rocking, swaying. It's never spinny. It just has this very unnerving sensation of constantly being on a boat. um, so at that point, obviously, because it was so unnerving, I was chasing cures and really running myself ragged, trying to not live with this sensation. And for 2 years, especially, I ended up, my marriage nearly broke up. I was living with my mother. I could barely walk across the street without someone holding my hand. I lost my career. I couldn't look at screens. So I wasn't communicating with people, wasn't doing my job as a filmmaker. And I just wanted it to go away. And through that period of constantly searching, constantly trying new techniques and doctors and you name it, I finally had to face this idea of what if I can't fix this?
Yeah, you said I
And
read
what would that
I read your story, and you said you had I don't know if it was a cousin or a relative who said, "What if you can't do anything about
Mhm.
this? What will you do?" And that was a turning point for you. So please continue as I
that
interrupted.
Yeah, I get. I was like, no, that's not an option. But it planted a seed in me and it definitely grew to the point where now I can honestly say that letting the curing go actually gave my brain the time it needed to relax. As if the pursuit itself was telling my brain that I was in danger, if that makes sense. And so I think for some of us, especially that have had that sort of hypervigilance around our bodies and, what does everything mean? I needed to tell my brain that I was safe. And chasing cures was not the message of safety. So, ironically, letting myself live unfixed, meaning allowing the experience of imperfection and discomfort and pain, even to be part of my experience, not negating the joy and the fulfillment and the purpose that can also be part of that. They don't have to eliminate each other. Um, and by doing that, I still have symptoms, but they are much less. And I think I did give my brain the chance to finally find its own set point again. So essentially, I think the curing chasing was a trauma response. And so those that we all know about trauma these days. And I think when we are in a trauma state, we need to feel safe. And so Unfixed is a place of safety, really. It's a place of allowing, it's a place of letting life be a bit messy and trusting that we are resilient enough to experience the fullness of life within it.
It's interesting to me because when I was doing my research before speaking to you, it seems like, you're describing having, I want to say it correctly, debarquement. It
It's
feels like I should.
French, so it's if
French.
you want to say it like the French,
Debarquement.
mal de debarquement.
Oh, it's nice to have a pretty a disorder with a pretty name.
Yeah,
I suppose. But
we'll give it that.
What struck me was, as you're speaking, that your disorder was a trauma response that was kind of over another trauma response. I could not help but be struck about, and I've seen this so many times in life, how well sometimes our bodies pick our illnesses and disorders for us, because you had gone through something that's sort of finding out you had in your family kind of a little bit of a slightly unstable and colorful home life, which so many of us have had when you're growing up. And then later on, you found out that your father was not your biological father. Mm-hmm. And that seemed to be unsteady and give you an emotional sense of being unstable all the time. And then your body said, okay, we'll give you more of that.
Mm-hmm. It's so true, isn't it? I mean, it's almost like if this were to be written in a screenplay, someone would be like, oh, come on, it's just too much of a parallel there. But it's exactly what happened. My foundation, my family foundation cracked, and the ground underneath me became wobbly, and physically I became wobbly. I mean, it's quite a perfect metaphor.
Did you find that with a lot of people that you've worked with in your Unfixed Media projects? Did they have a similar thread?
Some did, or some had more of the earlier traumas. And then suddenly after 20, 30 years, it just starts to rise up. What I did also find, the communities overlap, but also they call them, now I'm forgetting the term, but the non-paternity event people like me that have discovered later in life that their father is not their father.
They have a name for it. They call it a non-paternity event.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, if you Google NPE, there's a whole collection of human beings now that are having these experiences thanks to Ancestry and 23andMe. Mm-hmm. And the many that I have spoken with, have this extreme destabilizing experience that manifests through panic attacks, through a dizziness. Actually, Dani Shapiro, if you know the author Dani Shapiro, she had a non-paternity event in her later life, and she wrote a whole book about it, a bestseller called Inheritance. And I remember reading that before I kind of had much of a language for what I was experiencing. I was dizzy and I was miserable, but I read the book. And as soon as she found out, she went into the bathroom and the whole room just wobbled as she looked in the mirror. And I remember being like, this is real. I'm not just crazy. There's something when the ground has been pulled out from underneath us, our body responds. Mm-hmm. So yes, with the chronic illness community, not necessarily the same symptoms, but manifestations or early signs of a disease progression do often begin after a traumatic event.
Yes. And I just want to share a little bit, though. I will say I feel it's a no-no in podcasts to talk about yourself too much, but I'm going to in this
Oh
case.
yeah, I
I
like
have
it.
You're a great guest, Kim. um, I have multiple myeloma, which is a blood cancer. And in that blood cancer, what your the marrow in your bones is doing, it's producing too much of this useless antibody, like too much of this plasma. And the problem with it is it crowds out all the good stuff that you need. But I felt that if I look about the events in my life, my sister had died now it's 11 years. And I had a big trauma at the funeral. Like an aunt who we were estranged from came and threatened me in the church. And it was clear that other relatives had arranged for her to be there. And I felt I was already exhausted and I just had lost my sister. And I felt like it put my defenses, emotionally, into this hyperdrive. And I think my body then just started doing that. Well, like, we're just going to keep producing this, antibody that you don't need this much of.
Yeah.
And it kept doing that. And it was like, it's something that is definitely real. Now, I don't want to, for anybody listening to, illnesses, also can have obviously environmental factors, not just the emotional impact. But in my experience, like the kind of cancer I have, a lot of things are like these algebra equations where it's this times this plus this times that equals your whatever you wind up with. And too much of any of those things will do it. But it always struck me how, okay, when I was diagnosed, which is now about 4 years ago, that kind of fits what's been going on. So, I did want to ask, like, you said you've seen it in some people, and some people, I don't want to say they haven't figured it out yet, but obviously other illnesses, they can be genetic and you could be exposed to a chemical and it's got nothing to do with the emotional side of your life. So in your case though, what you have also, I would say, myeloma can be this way, one of the more annoying physical issues. And when I say that, I just mean that you have one of those things where somebody would look at you and say, you look fine. So it's not obvious that you're dealing with something.
Yeah.
What made you, though, eventually decide, like, I'm going to do a project out of this. I'm going to talk to other people who are like me, but not quite like me, see what's going on with them. How did that come about?
Desperation. Pure desperation and isolation. Prior to all of this, I was a filmmaker. I'd done some documentary projects and some narrative projects, but I'd really focused mostly on sort of the creative explorations. And this was just like, I need to find people that are living with something that they can't fix. And I grew up in a family that was so much of the Louise Hayes and Christian Northrup and Heal Your Body, Heal Your Mind. And everything was sort of the control of the self-help movement was very alluring to me as a young woman, and made me believe that I could be in control through all the chaos of the family and everything. And I found the need to just, through the sort of seeds planted of my own vulnerability and living with my vulnerability, I needed to know if other people were doing this and how, how they were doing it. So I first started, this was 2019, pre-pandemic, and I
Great
found
time to start a project.
Oh yeah,
right? For
great time to
anybody.
start a documentary on chronic illness. So I found about 20 subjects, and some of them were here in Portland. And I started raising money, and my plan was to travel to these individuals and learn from their stories. And I had, interviewed them already on the phone, done pre-interviews, and just started to already kind of fall in love with them. Like, I felt a kinship, even though we were sometimes from opposite political spectrums and very different symptoms, but like, oh, I get you. Oh, I understand you. The first subject was Dylan in Portland, Oregon, where I'm from. And Dylan is a young man. He's 43 and lives with ALS. And He had just finished his 6th year in double doctorate medical degree, naturopathic and classical Chinese medicine, and had, a shoulder that stopped working. And this led very quickly into an ALS diagnosis. And by the time I met him in 2019, we had a 3-day film shoot and he couldn't speak. Other than through a eye tracking device where he would type out the letters, and then the computer would read it out. And so I've developed a relationship with him over the last 5 years that's been very deep, even though I've never heard his voice. I've never seen him walk across a room.
You worked with him on his, you were a big
Yes.
part of his book coming together.
Yes, this is one has been a big project in the last year. Over the last 5 years since I've been working on Unfixed, there's always, sort of a need that arises. And usually it's in the form of film. But 2 years ago, Dylan was like, I don't think I have much time left. What am I going to do? And I thought, well, as you know, with film, 90% of what they share is edited out. And so I have all that on a drive on my computer. And I thought, it's already typed out since everything he shares is typed and then read by the computer monitor. And so I thought, well, why don't we see if we can raise some money and hire an editor to compile all of these beautiful essays that you've written.
I just want to say to people, the book is called Liberation of Being. And if this is how Dylan just speaks extemporaneously, very impressive. I mean, it's lovely the way he speaks and the stories he tells and how he describes his life. I mean, we should all hope we can speak that well about ourselves. So I just wanted to give a little plug and mention, like, I did not realize that was all I don't want to say the leftovers, but as you're saying, the outtakes from the interviews.
Yeah.
Wow. That is impressive.
Now I would say about 80% of it. Then we dug through the archives and got some things that he'd written prior to the diagnosis. And then I also interviewed his inner circle, family and friends, to fill in the holes since he was unable to type anymore at that point. But anyway, that was 2019. Then the pandemic happened and I was still in my desperate, how do I live with this mode? And we ended up just having these conversations with the 20 individuals and saying, let's keep this going through the pandemic. But instead of me coming to you, you film yourselves with your wonderful little smartphones and I guide you through that process. And for every month for 2.5 years, I would send them a prompt and answer that question myself first so that they could not be talking into a black hole. And then they would share back with me their response. And then we edited that into a docu-series. So once a month, all kinds of different questions, from your relationship to food to would you give up everything you've learned since you've been diagnosed in order to be healed? I mean, kind of the whole range of psychological to practical.
Let's dive into that question because that is a big one.
Yeah.
What would people say if they could give up everything they've learned to be healed? What's their response? And what's your personal response?
Yeah. Well, the majority was no. And also the majority was ask me today. Mm-hmm. So, which is a wonderful realization with chronic illness is that, it's only about today because there's so much unpredictability. So even when you ask your friends that have chronic illness, just say, how are you doing today? Because how are you doing globally? I don't know. It's going to change. It might even change the next hour. So people would say today, no, I wouldn't. I've as Dylan said, to him, it would be as if to give up his soul. So much of who he has become is through sort of the carving away of all the distractions of life that he thought were part of him. He thought were necessary to who his most fulfilled, evolved self would be, and those are carved away. And he wouldn't want that to. He wouldn't want to go back in time. So it's a fascinating question, and I actually got the question back decades ago when I was working for a bereavement center. I had a theater troupe of young adults who had lost parents through suicide or murder or cancer. And they asked themselves that question on stage. And would you give up everything you've learned since your dad has died in order to have them back? And none of those beautiful young adults said yes. And I remember it being quite controversial in the audience when they performed it because some people were like, "How dare you not want that person back?" But there's something that rises up through adversity that people value.
Mhm. Well, I feel too what you're speaking about again is the people who are not in the club, who haven't been touched, who haven't been ill or had a big loss. They really don't know. And they judge by, and they judge, judgment being the key word, by a very different metric where once you've had that experience or something in the realm of the experiences we're talking about, you just know better. You just know better. Do you find that there's a difference between people who have a disorder or a disability that will be with them for the rest of their life, but is not terminal compared to people who have something that will eventually take their their physical lives and this incarnation, as I say?
Yeah. Well, for example, Dylan, of course, there's another woman who has blood cancer. Hers is called polycythemia vera.
Not too much iron, I think that one is, or something. I think
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah. And it creates kind of a sludgy
Yep.
situation. Made me think of her when you shared your story. And for her, the contemplation of death is a big part of that. And while uncertainty and in death overlap, and certainly chronic illness is a lot of uncertainty, it doesn't necessarily necessitate contemplating death. It can, but I think that that's the big difference. Those that know that there's a terminal illness, I feel like there's much more attention on that process of letting go. Um, in a way, it's similar though, because the process of letting go of control and living with the uncertainty that we get from chronic illness is very similar. So we're getting our practices in, and then 40 years from now, when I croak, I might feel a little bit more relaxed about the thing because it's because I've been practicing it every day.
Yeah.
So
I will say for me, Kim, I'm really apologizing because usually when
I
I do
love it.
interviews, I try to Larry King it, like make it about my guests. But your topic and having you on, it brings out different things for me that I feel the need to speak about.
I'm
So,
so glad. And I do podcasts too, and I feel like sharing your own story I think it helps. Personally, I actually like a little bit of that exchange.
I hope so. I know it's going to help me, but the people listening, oh well. So but for in my case, it's that I think my diagnosis came about during the pandemic, so it was delayed and I wound up bedridden, and then I was in a wheelchair, and I had to use a walker. Like I had to learn to walk again a little bit. I mean, it was very bad. I had a lot of bone breakage in my diagnosis, but for me, the experience of finding out what I had, first of all, it was different than other cancer patients because by the time I was diagnosed, I was so relieved. Like I knew something was wrong and my doctor wouldn't move on it. And she just let me languish in bed. But the
Mm.
other thing it did was it really cut right through my ego. Like and I'm not saying I don't have any ego now. I certainly do. But there was a moment where I realized, like Dylan, like all the stuff that I thought I had to have and do and be and was trying to please and trying to achieve, it didn't. It wasn't me. It wasn't actually what counted about me.
Yeah.
And I had that whole experience where I realized, nope, my body, it's just the canoe I'm rowing through life in. It's not, it's all can all go out the window. And that was it was a big, I don't want to say relief, but it was just a big aha thing. So, that Oprah moment, aha moment. So it was a big one of those. And I figured that like other people, also have had that experience, but people who are well and walking around, when you're ill and you turn, and I'm sure people in your project, I do want to talk about this, but when you're ill and you turn on the TV, it's almost surreal to see what people are worried about and involved in and what we're entertained by.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say that largely early on, especially, it was really hard for me to grow my audience outside of the chronic illness community because even friends, say, close friends, said it's too sad. And I said, well, you're not watching it then because these stories are actually leave you feeling hopeful for humanity. Yeah, it's a bummer, but there is so much grace and so much love that rises up through these individuals that are dealing with extreme pain and suffering. And it's like, I would watch that stuff all day long because it makes you go, yay, for humans, we're pretty awesome. So there is this knee-jerk response in the able-bodied, healthy world, which is largely conditioned too by our society that it's like avoid this at all costs. But once you got it, yeah, it sucks and it's hard. And we're forced to really dig into what matters and how to find that joy. And the high side of it is then when we do, the joy is unconditional. Whereas in the other camp, the joy is still because, you got these followers on Instagram and you got the perfect family and whatever. And when you can find joy in the middle of absolute desperation, you're like, wow, okay, I guess these two things can live alongside one another. And that's pretty freeing.
Yeah, I did, but you're touching on something that I don't have an answer for, and I'm not sure if you do, but it is how, and I keep using the word club. I'm just going to use it. That's my way of defining it. You're either in the club or not in the club. Yeah. It's like, how do people in the club communicate with people outside the club? How are you seen? Because I could see in your work too, that there is this frustration with how people outside the club look at, and you're even saying avoid, like you don't want to be those people. How do you bridge that? How's it going?
Well, you made me think of one of the other subjects. Her name is Elizabeth Jameson, and she is just full of vitality. She's had very aggressive MS for, I want to say now, probably 20 years. She was a lawyer. And then when her voice kind of faded away, she became an artist. And then when her hands stopped working, she became a writer through dictation. And now she actually directs one of the webcasts that I do with MS. It's a panel of MS patients. And we open it up to the public. And she does not shy away from just saying it like it is. And I remember her describing a moment where a kid, sometimes when she'd go to the coffee shop, she's in a wheelchair and kids would kind of be like, what's this? And they'd want to run up and talk to her about it. And the parents were the ones that were like, oh no, we can't do this. Like, this is, let's give her space, or they would get awkward. But the kids were like, what's it like? I want to roll around. And Elizabeth just found that kind of energy infectious. And so she decided, let's just be very vocal about all these experiences, from the discomforts and the embarrassment and the shame. And more often than not, even the able-bodied people will recognize parts of themselves. Oh yeah, I've felt shame, or oh yeah, I've felt awkward. And so ironically, this MS show, it's called MS Confidential, isn't just for MS patients. People will listen in and find things for themselves to celebrate and relate to. And so I think for that's sort of a global answer for your question, which is just share, just talk about it. And some people are going to be scared of it, and then some are going to lean in and want to learn more.
Yeah. I have to say, though, I have been surprised. I'm in my mid 50s. I think we're somewhere around each other
Yeah.
in vintage
I
there.
turn 50 next year.
And I have been, and I have quite a few friends who are in their 60s, mid 60s. And I have been surprised that how uninterested, how disengaged they are from the idea that their life will end, that they will get a diagnosis, that something will happen. It's not, yes, we all hear about those people who die in their sleep when they're 90. Most of us are not those people.
Nope.
And I was very impressed. This is some years ago. I remember some Jane Fonda interview. I don't know, she's got to be getting close to 90 herself, but this is when she was 70 or so. And I think 70, 75. And she was talking about engaging in like the last part of her life. Like she understood I'm entering the last part of my life and certain things will happen. We all ride it until the wheels fall off, but there should be some engagement with, in my view, with that reality. Now, I feel I'm lucky because when I was very little, my father's 10 years older than my mother, and his parents were very old when I was born. I mean, my grandfather was 87 when I was born and died when I was 10. So he was 97. And so I saw that what goes on, but a lot of people don't have any, it's like, if I don't look, it's not there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really true. We find each other because there are humans that do want to talk about it. I'm thinking of an author I share a lot over on Substack, and one of the stacks that I follow is called Death and Birds. And it's beautifully written. I think she's been writing for probably a year, and she's grown her following to like just thousands of people overnight. I mean, it's phenomenal. And the reason why she can speak on death and birds is, one, she works in an aviary. So she helps like baby birds that have been brought in. But on the other side, she's a death doula. So she has weekly conversations with families and people that are dying, and how to transition with as much agency as possible. And it's just, I think I've found, I mean, it's like the unfixed work. It's inspiring, it's uplifting, it's thrilling even to contemplate these subjects without sort of the cloak of fear and ugliness and shame that our society offers. So anyway, Chloe Hope, Death and Birds, if anyone does want to learn more about this, that's the place to go. But I think that the conversation needs to grow, and it's largely up to these podcasts and books to start those conversations, because still the general media, I mean, indie films tackle it sometimes beautifully, but it's still not a hot topic. Death and illness are not hot topics.
And something, I do get that to some extent because, there is a part of life where, especially those first 20 years, even up to your first 30 years, if you're healthy, and not everyone in their youth is, but if it's okay for your life to be about expansion and not think about those things, and to be busy trying to, find your mate and build your nest, blah, 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 whatever.
Yeah.
But then there comes a point somewhere probably in middle age where it's like, it should be, whether you're dealing with aging parents, or by now you've had maybe a smattering of friends who've had some issues or accidents or whatever. But there is it almost seems like a self-fulfilling fear where where people can be worried about the loneliness and isolation and the lack of control. And so in not engaging with it, you're creating loneliness and isolation and for other people, because it's not bad, except for you just want people to be there and to be calm and chill.
Yeah. Yeah, and to feel like you get to participate in it. I watched a wonderful 20-minute New York Times documentary a couple weeks ago, and it was this about this little salt and vinegar Spanish ex-nun. She had actually been removed from the convent because she was like caught reading a newspaper or something. But anyway, she was turning 80 and she knew the date that she wanted to die. And so, we're getting to a little bit more of like the assisted suicide zone too, but there was a part, and they didn't talk about that so much. It was more about like this, the documentarian really wanted to explore with her why she wanted to choose the day. And for her, it was just because she wanted to bring awareness to it. She wanted the time to prepare, to let go, to honor her life, feel grateful. So there was nothing about her that was like, I hate life, I'm gonna get out of here. It was like the opposite. And she wanted to, when she finally let go, to be awake and aware that it was happening. And I thought, what could be more beautiful than that, especially if
Mm,
you could choose to have your loved ones with you? And I don't know. I mean, I haven't talked about, my mom and I have been talking about this a lot. She turns 80, or she turned 80 last month, and she's still very vivacious. But I think that these conversations are really important to have
mm.
instead of just letting it, you know, oops, I died. And then the family picks up all the pieces and then grieves for 30 years, you know?
Yeah. There's two things I would just want to add about that. There is a part where no one should feel bad that they can't control the circumstances of their death, because
Yeah.
even when you make plans, even when my
Mhm.
sister was in a hospice, things go awry. It doesn't always. I mean, it's like that boxing metaphor from Mike Tyson, where it's like everybody's got a plan when you step into the ring, and it changes the moment you take that first punch. It's like things will go awry. But the other thing you do, there's the beauty though of being able to, this idea of like cross yourself over. There is a movie, I think it's from the 80s or the 90s, and I'm not sure if I'm going to get it right. I think it was called Little Buddha. It
Mm.
was, I'm not sure if that's the name. It had Chris Isaac and Bridget Fonda, and their son was being looked at as he might be the next, it's not the Dalai Lama, it's a Dalai something in the context of the film.
Yeah.
But there is an older Buddhist monk who, after they have found, like they're getting down to finding this older monk, his job is to like find the new Dalai from this pool of kids. And when that is done, he goes into a room and starts to meditate to die, and is able to, in
Mm.
this film, like release himself from his body. I think that's something we can all aspire to.
Yeah.
Don't know if it happens. I'm not really sure actually how it worked out for the nun. Was she able to complete
The
her
last shot was the cleaning out of her apartment. So, like I said, he didn't want to focus on the actual dying and how she did it. But yeah, he closed the door on her apartment. And so she fulfilled her wishes and she was quite happy about it.
good for
And
her?
even her grandson, there was a moment where he came in and he was very pissed about it and was not happy about it and didn't understand and thought the whole thing was crazy. And so, um, it brings up a lot of different complex relational issues. But I do think the conversation itself, whether or not people do it, I just think it's a good conversation to have. And it's similar with all of these challenges in life, the adversity that we have to face. It's so much better when we do it together and when we have
Mm,
conversations about it.
mhm. I've said to people in other shows I've done, being incarnate is difficult. I mean, just even when you're healthy, you have to keep your body at a certain temperature. So you got to
Yeah.
have the shelter and be warm, and you have to feed your body, and your body has to rest. So, and that's when everything's going well.
Yeah. Yeah.
The minute you start laying in other challenges, whether they're physical or not being able to have the shelter, it's kind of like, I
Yeah.
could go, I could stay, I could go. It's, it's a decision. Maybe.
It's so going back to Dylan, to me, I mean, he's been literally stationary for 4 years, has not reached out to a friend, walked through a room, used his voice, breathed on his own, and he will choose to exit. But it's only because he doesn't want to, what they call it, being locked out, where his eyes won't be able to communicate, yes, I want to be here anymore or not. And so he wants to do that before that happens. But other than that, he's still feeling like there's something to learn about this life. There's still
Mhm.
something that, and actually, you walk into his space there, he lives in a tracheostomy home. So there's other individuals there, just a few. His room is full of energy and life. The plants are just like bananas. They are so alive in there, and the light is pouring through. And you touch his arm or his hand, and it's warm. It's not cold. There's so much vitality in him. And so, for whatever reason, um, for him, life is still worth living,
Mhm.
even though all of those other things have been stripped away. And to me, that's a remarkable thing to learn from. That's a remarkable human to learn from.
Kim, you've learned it yourself too. Like he is, and I mean, I haven't met him, so I'm just a judgy person who here, but he said yes. Like, yes,
Yeah.
here I am, and I am here.
Yeah.
And you had a similar thing when you said, okay, I have mal debarquement, or
I love that.
oh, I embarrassed myself. But you say, yes, I'm not going to fight it. And you had a different kind of energy show up for you when
Yeah.
you said yes. And he says yes. And it's amazing how much energy you can still have with whatever illness you have if you allow it to be.
Yes.
And
Yeah, and I love that you
Mhm.
use that word allow, because to me, allowing is different than accepting. And I know a lot of people in the chronic illness community have a hard time with that word acceptance. And I don't use it much either. It's acceptance feels resigned. Allowing feels like there's still some sort of agency. Like, yeah, you're welcome here. And if it's really bad, I'm going to get pissed about it that day. And I'll allow myself to be pissed about it. So there's this real sort of relational kind of dynamic with the illness, and not just this, okay, fine, I accept it.
Mhm.
And I feel like that's what's going on with Dylan too. Yeah, he's in conversation with it daily.
Yeah, it is a different, yeah, he definitely is. And I will say, I mean, there is part of me where I talk about my situation, your physical situation. And I do look at someone like Dylan where I say, he's got he's like an advanced placement.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah,
I'm
crash
just in
course.
yes, and I'm in the regular academic level of this. And here's a guy who's, getting his advanced degree. And
Yeah.
and he is such a great example to really, no matter how it is, you can still allow and be having your life,
Yeah.
and having that energy. I mean,
Yeah. I'll give you another example for those that are listening. I learned a lot of this also. Shout out to my husband. He had a daughter 30 years ago who was born with intellectual disability, but she had seizures, and nobody really knows what happened. But she is probably at the level of about a 6 or 7 year old, and lives in a care home with a couple other young women, and has a job, and is doing really well, but has never been, the American standard of thriving or succeeding. And my husband was the person I went back to after I was living with my mom for those 7 months and felt horrible about my life, and the dizziness wouldn't go away. It was getting worse, and I couldn't find an answer. And I finally just actually had to come back because of the tail end of a bicycle accident. I had to go through some forgetting the word, but the not disposition, but one of those things that they do with lawyers, where I had
oh,
to
deposition, a
deposition.
deposition.
Thank you. It was something along those lines. And so I was forced to come back, but it was the best thing ever, because essentially came back into the arms of somebody who didn't need to fix me. And while I was still running the show of like, I got to find it. Now I'm back in Portland. I have to find a new neurologist, blah, 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 blah. He was like, just, you know, just let's let it be, because that's what he had to do with his daughter. He could have ran through all the gamuts and all. I did all that when I first met him. I like put her on all the diets and put her with all the PTs and therapists and everything. And
Mhm.
at the end of some of those things helped, but at the end of the day, she was Sid, and that's who she was. And he, through her 30 years, just learned to love her as she was, as this unique human being. And so falling asleep next to Dave, even though it was in not so many words every night, I felt like I woke up in the morning with a little bit an inch closer to myself as I was, instead of as the person that I thought I could be when I found the cure. So that I think is also a lesson that a lot of parents with children with disability and anybody on the autism spectrum, there's that leaning in finally and going, well, I could waste all my dollars and all my years trying to make this go away, or I can just let it shine and see what it has to say.
Yeah, very important. It's very
Yeah.
important. I did want to ask you, so you're winding up the Unfixed project. The last portion is called Why We Matter. Do I have this right?
Yes. Mhm.
So why are you wrapping it up and why do
Well,
we
it's
matter?
not necessarily wrapping up. It was wrapping up with those individuals. So what happened after the pandemic with those 20 individuals is we did the docuseries, and then we had the final question, which is sort of, why does your story matter in this world? And right now I have all of their answers built as just little one minute answers, which are just beautiful kind of little teasers. But that will be worked into a larger film. But since then, and now that the world has opened up again, Unfixed has turned into so many more projects. And so the Unfixed is continuing. It's not ending at all. In fact, it's growing. And finally, the audience is growing as well. It's just diversifying. The original cast, they're moving on in their lives and they're doing their own thing. And there's more stories that need to be told. And so that's where the MS Confidential shows come in. That's where Dylan's books come in. I even spent the last year writing my own memoir, and I'm sharing that over on Substack and continuing the Unfixed dialogue, but in a bigger conversation, so that Unfixed doesn't just include chronic illness, but it also includes climate change and divorce and trauma, and recognizing that ultimately we are all unfixed. And that's kind
Mhm.
of the goal, is that the silos break down and we start to see that this is just a human story.
Mhm. Yeah, what you say to me reminds me. Next week, I have an interview with a guy named James Doty, who's over at Stanford, and he has started a compassion center. He's a neurosurgeon, but he has started a compassion center. And it almost seems to me that a lot of your work is about building empathy where it
Mhm.
doesn't exist
Yes.
amongst people, as we're all human and all in these bodies, and we're just seeing each other differently, and we're really not.
Yes, absolutely. I love that you shared that. I mean, boy, if I could, call myself a compassion media center, that would be great. But it's true, because I do think that we can read about this stuff academically, but when you hear somebody, that's the beauty of documentary. When you hear somebody just speak from the heart about their experience, there's so much less judgment.
Mm-hmm.
It's storytelling is how we learn from each other.
Yes. And it touches on the storytelling you're doing. It really though does strike that chord to me, where so many people, for example, who, you said, you kind of came from that Hay House, like we can fix it background, and so do I. And I feel that
Mhm.
um people shouldn't, the older I am and the more experiences I've had, I realize like that's not necessarily something to pursue. You know, a portion of the show is about manifesting, but there's a limit really on what you can manifest. And I'm not trying to be a naysayer. It's just that that's how it is. And
Yeah.
trying to fix everything and having the belief, I guess that's something that I wanted to get, like having the belief that you can fix or overcome or change everything if your energy is just right, if you're just engaged in the right practice, is not correct, actually. And that no one should be going down any sort of shame spiral. I mean, and the reason I mentioned shame is because, we were talking about that earlier, and that the idea of shame. Boy, Brene Brown, she really got a good topic when she picked shame, because that shame is the thing that is keeping people apart and keeping people feeling like they should. So when you're diagnosed, you spend 2 years because you in your mind and the way you visioned it, you should be living a different life.
Yeah.
And this stupid vestibular disorder is stopping you from living it. So you had to go, I'm sure, through that whole anger process and denial process and fighting it process. It's based in that shame of like not being able to, and it's a completely human thing. We all do it, of not being able to roll with, well, that thing I thought I should be doing. Well, my belief was wrong. That belief was wrong. This is what it is.
And by believing that, I'm saying to all the people that haven't fixed it that they're less than. They're not, their lives aren't as valuable. I mean, I feel like there's can be some real dangerous territory when we cross over into life coaching and you can have it all. And because I do think that there is a subtle violence towards ourselves, first of all,
Beautifully
but then
said. Subtle violence. Beautifully said. Go on.
no, yeah, it's towards the self, but it's also towards the other and anyone that is living without what they're trying to get rid of, or living with what that other person is trying to get rid of. It's a very slippery slope. And I think that finding for me compassion towards myself and my unfixedness and my vulnerability and the shame around that has made it so much easier to let in all the other lives. And boy, that was not me when I was little ballerina perfectionist when I was 16.
And again, I do think it's somewhat normal when you're in the first 20 years of your life, or even a little bit more, to not have the knowledge, to not see. It's great there are some teenagers who are more enlightened than average, who can see that, but it's hard to have compassion for other people's humanity and frailty and your own. And so many of us unfixed people, it's like, I'm glad I was brought along to learn more of that. And you're bringing people along, which is fabulous. Fabulous, fabulous. So are you ready for my lightning round of questions? Because I see we've been
I think so. My brain can be lightning for you. I never would describe my brain that way, but
okay. So my first question to you is, what do you think is a well-lived life?
A well-lived life is a life that allows the experience that presents itself to be part of who you are, to just allow life every moment.
Beautiful. Beautiful. What do you suspect, and this is more of one of my physics questions, what do you suspect is the true nature of reality? We didn't really discuss after death, but even just in this realm, what do you think is the nature of reality?
Nature of reality is multitudes, certainly not binary, and certainly not what we can conceive with our cognition, but multitudes.
How do you think people can better engage or be connected to their soul or their consciousness or their spirit, whatever word you prefer?
The first thing that came to mind is to talk to her, talk to him, talk to her as if it were a child, an adorable child. And I only say that because I think the soul has a level of innocence. And so there's nothing to solve. It's just have a conversation with the innocence.
I also think you touch on something. It's if only we could talk to ourselves with that kind of kindness,
Yeah. Yeah.
which we often don't do.
Yeah.
Instead, we're talking to each other like the screw up teenager, like, what? What are you
Yeah.
doing? You're
Come
late. You're this.
on.
um, what do you hope to find after you die, if anything, if you believe something goes on?
I would like to just have omniscient awareness. I would like to be know what it's like to be a tree and a crow and the mycelia in the dirt. I would like sort of omniscient awareness.
And this one you'll know for sure. Where can people find you and the good work that you are doing?
I can answer that one. Well, the best place to go is unfixedmedia.com. And through Unfixed Media, you could be led to the YouTube channel. You could be led to the Substack where all the writing happens, and some of the social media that I don't keep up anymore at all, but it's there with lots of content and stories from patient narratives, all of that. But Unfixed Media is the place.
Okay. And is there anything you would like to, any final words you'd like to impart to the listening audience today?
Well, actually, I just want to say to you, and maybe this is because also that everyone else is listening, but I loved hearing your story. And I hope that the audience, receives that and wants more because you have a lot of wisdom and so much to offer. And so it was thrilling for me to hear little bits of that. And I think, if I probably will become a regular listener now, and I'm going to want to hear more.
You're the best guest ever, Kim. Thank you. Thanks for watching. Click to join us on another journey, and don't forget to subscribe.